I hope you're enjoying Walter Brueggemann's book, The Prophetic Imagination. I'm finding, I'm teaching a Sunday school class, the Adult Ed Forum, on the prophets as well, and I'm getting myself a little bit confused as to what I went over where. So if you find some redundancy in what we've gone over in this particular class, um, please chalk it up to that. But we have been talking about Brueggemann's analysis of the prophetic imagination as consisting of two poles. First of all, the idea of prophetic criticism, uh, actually standing up and criticizing the powers that be, the structures that are keeping uh, people in oppression. And this, of course, the model was Moses in Egypt. But the other side of that is prophetic energizing, which draws on the stories of a tradition and the idea of God's promise. And he mentioned last time that there are three energizing dimensions to the prophetic imagination. The first of these is just embracing the darkness and realizing that in the midst of difficult times, in the midst of oppression, that God is still working on both sides of the street. God was working in the heart of Pharaoh as well as in the community of the Hebrews. Um, and then also the realization that God, and this is where liberation theology has made the best inroads, God has a preferential option for the poor. And that God is not, that the experience of God is not going to happen somewhere in eternity, which is often, how it's presented, but God is acting here and now and can be experienced here and now, um, and can perhaps best be discerned at certain breaking points, where things are the most difficult, where the oppression and injustice seems to be the most extreme. And then finally, the last act of the prophetic energizing is a reflection on the name of God's self, and that is God's name is I will be whatever I will be. In other words, it's kind of a rebuke. Don't try to name me because what naming does is, you know, make something absolute. It concretizes, if that's a word, it makes it concrete, right? God is constantly changing. God is constantly in um, relationship with the world. And to try to place that idea, to place God in a box, so to speak, to define God in such a way is, it, is contrary to the nature of God. So, but this realization, along with the preferential option for those who are in the midst of injustice, uh, evokes a sense of doxology. And this is first seen in the Hebrew tradition with the Song of Miriam. And this is where we left off last time. And I wanted to mention it's really interesting that if you do read the Exodus story, and its source was in that Elohist tradition that we talked about, if we read the Exodus story, you will see when you come into, when the people come through the Red Sea and they see the Egyptian soldiers are taken in by the sea. Uh, Miriam, Moses's sister, responds with gratitude. And you can see how this breaks in the story. It's going along, and you can see in narrative fashion that it's being written. But then all of a sudden, you see this poetic aspect come through, where the lines are broken up into stanzas. And scholars believe that this is perhaps the oldest strand of literature that we have in the Hebrew Bible, not to mention the New Testament as well, or in the Christian Bible. This, because of its form, because of its structure, most likely goes back to the oral tradition that had its source in this liberating experience that the Hebrew people, whoever and wherever they were, I should say, however many they were, this tradition uh, can probably be traced back through this song to that experience. And so, kind of interesting that scholars have identified that. But we often think that we're reading history when we're reading about the Exodus from Egypt. We don't even know who the Pharaoh was, right? So we have to rely upon just what the text tells us as well as archaeology. But the text and the structure of Miriam's doxology suggests that this is an old situation, an old text itself. I wanted to mention to you, I think Andrea just joined us, Andrea Hayes, but she was sharing with me a liturgy and a resource for her church, the First Congregational Church. And in that, there was a bibliography. And I was taken by this book by Sung Chan Ra, who's I believe he may be at a Presbyterian seminary, but it's called Prophetic Lament, A Call for Justice in Troubled Times. I think it's quite, relevant to what we're talking about. The lament is part of the energizing, right? Remember that we were talking about the criticism is often founded in grief, that things are not as they should be. But that grief carries over eventually into doxology. I think from what I can tell of this book that Sung Chan Ra is probably going to focus on the book of Lamentations, which is really, really obscure in the Old Testament, but it's the lamentations of the Israelites, the Judahites, as Jerusalem was being destroyed by the Babylonians. And so I'm hoping to order this through the bookstore, and when it comes through, I'll give you a little overview on what I find out. But I'm really happy that this book introduced itself in the midst of this study. Um, Moving on, uh, Brueggemann concludes chapter one. Now, I just want to read these three things where he talks about the alternative life of the prophetic imagination, uh, and how it's essential to just any community that's in the midst of a prophetic experience. But it's always lived, he says, in a particular historical and historicizing community. You know, it's always going to be responding to situations on the ground, and the creativity that comes out of that will be a response to the situation of injustice through the Holy Spirit, as God continues to stay active in that community. The community criticizes and energizes by its special memories that embrace discontinuity and genuine breaks from imperial reality. This has happened before. We know how the story has worked out in the past. We have a story that we can find ourselves in the midst of, that we can place ourselves in the midst of. And this is very important to have an alternative story, one that comes out of the prophetic imagination itself. And then finally, the community gathered around memories knows that it's defined by and is at the disposal of a God who is as yet unco-opted and uncontained by empire. And this being the last comment in chapter one, you can pretty much get a sense that we're going to find out in chapter two how God is co-opted by empire, thus setting up the dichotomy that we're working with in this book, the alternative community of Moses and the royal consciousness of David, Solomon, and the monarchical tradition of Judah. So, any comments about this or insights you want to offer? Well, if not, please allow me this brief little historical interlude because we're going to jump forward about 250 years. And I know that I've introduced this in the Sunday school class that I've been teaching, but just as a review, in case you weren't in that class, from the time of Moses up until the time of Solomon, there is a 250-year expanse of time, and a lot happens in that time. The alternative community of Moses and its ideals eventually comes to be settled in the land of Canaan. Now, the Bible tells us, in the book of Joshua, that this was a conquest that happened. You know, they they moved in, they overcame the Amorites and the Canaanites, and there were bloody battles and all of this. Interestingly, archaeology doesn't support that. When Joshua fit the battle at Jericho, the walls came tumbling down. Well, at this time period, it does not appear that Jericho had walls around it. It was a relatively peaceful time. So most likely what happened is the Hebrew people escaping from Egypt came into the land of Canaan in whatever numbers, but probably small numbers, settled in the land and began to tell their experience of the story of liberation, and that came to take on, some cultic significance, and to be the story that identified them in this particular way. By 1200, this story had created for them a system of organization that focused on the idea that God is their king. And this can be read in the book of Judges. The judges were people on whom the Spirit of God rested in very, very difficult circumstances whenever, the need arose. Remember the freedom of God. You know, God would alight, the Spirit of God would alight upon Gideon, for example. And and Gideon would guide the people through whatever conflict there needed to be overcome. This was also the time period in which the prophets Eli and Samuel were responsible for maintaining the Ark of the Covenant, taking it to various communities and various tribal regions so that the people could worship God and be in God's presence. And this was done through the Ark of the Covenant, kind of the carry-on luggage that I talked about. But all of this is reflective of the name of God that Brueggemann wants to emphasize, that God will be whatever God will be. That God is not going to be contained in a particular place under particular, circumstances. God breaks the chains of all of the other ideas of God present at that time. But unfortunately, what happens around 1050 or so, in the land of Canaan, the 12 tribes are confederated. They come together every year and reaffirm their commitment to God. But the Philistines, who were inhabiting the region today that we know of as Gaza, had a particular technological advantage in being able to smelt iron and creating weapons that were far superior to what the bronze weapons of the Israelites were. And because of this difficulty, because of this threat, the people said, this confederation just doesn't work. We need some sort of centralized authority. We want a king. And they go to 1 Samuel 8. We can read about Samuel kind of warning them, look, you sure you want a king? You're going to have, they're going to conscript labor. They're going to tax you. They're going to take your children and put them in armies. And the people said, well, yeah, the Philistines are too great. We need a king. So thus begins the beginning of what we call the monarchical tradition. We know that King Saul was first anointed king, Saul from the tribe of Benjamin, and things just did not work out. David was later anointed, and David was able to confederate everybody under a much more structured type of government that had Jerusalem at its center and had this centralized authority. And the Ark of the Covenant was brought into Jerusalem and never left. So David had a perspective, a view right from the start that God needed to be next to the king, and the king and God needed to go hand in hand. It was up to Solomon, of course, King Solomon, to build the temple in which the Ark of the Covenant would be placed. So that's about 250 years of history. And Brueggemann begins chapter 2 with some preliminary reflections, lest we fall into the idea that prophetic criticism is about social activism. His first couple of chapters and the first couple of paragraphs in the chapter want to make it clear that this is a much bigger movement than what can be contained in the ideas or the activities of social activism. This isn't just politics. And he makes a really interesting point, but this movement of prophetic imagination focuses on matters linguistic and epistemological, how we speak about God and how we know God. You know, this is an experience of God that is utterly unique in the ancient Near East at this time. This is a God who chooses a people and has a preferential option for the poor amongst this people, at the same time is a God of freedom, a God that cannot simply be placed in a box. And Brueggemann makes a really interesting point. He says, you know, for a marginalized group of people, this is about the last option they really have because all of the other gods are taken, so to speak, or at least under the control of or under the manipulation of various city states. And what better option for the marginalized and for the poor to have a God who is utterly free in a way that they are free in their, in their marginalization. And so it is important to maintain that freedom, and that has to lie at the center of the prophetic imagination. But with the coming of, well, let me stop there. Are there any questions or comments about this? Rolling through the picture. I see Max joined us. Hello, Mac. Okay. Well, you probably know the story of Solomon. David dies in around 962, and there is immediately, as with all types of transitions of power, was one of the genius insights of the founding fathers of the United States that a peaceful transition of power helps to maintain the integrity of the republic, right? But the transition from David to Solomon was one that was just completely overwhelmed with blood and violence. Or excuse me, Solomon ends up killing his brother Adonijah, and his brother tries to manipulate David into taking the kingship, even while David is still on his deathbed. Solomon, destroys all of his enemies, all of actually a lot of David's allies that he didn't trust. He basically dispatches with them as quickly as possible and puts in place what Brueggemann calls a state-sponsored syncretism. Brueggemann doesn't really expand on this very much, but I think what he means is that what is put in place is going to result in an abandonment of the radicalness of the free God that was experienced by the Hebrew people in Egypt, and the experience of which, they tried to maintain throughout the time of the judges. Part of the state-sponsored syncretism was to do what all the other communities in the area were doing. Let's, build a wall around our city. Let's have a standing army. Let's place a temple in where God is going to be experienced and controlled, so to speak, and create the conditions for the possibility of people perceiving that as goes the empire, so goes the will of God. As goes the will of God, so goes the empire. So there is a ready marriage between the king and God the king now is the representative, the ultimate mediator between the people and the God of freedom. And obviously, Brueggemann makes the point that this is utterly contrary. This is a countercultural move, and it is going to upset the tables completely. Part of the syncretism involved, you know that by the end of his life, Solomon had pretty much allowed the worship of other religious traditions to infiltrate the land of Israel, the 12 tribes. And in the north, there was a agricultural tradition that had its roots, probably one of the oldest traditions among human beings, in the Canaanite gods of Baal and Asherah. We often refer to him as Baal, but it's Baal, literally means the Lord, and Asherah. There's another god at this time who is the high god of the Canaanites. His name is El, E-L, from which we get the word Elohim. So in the northern tradition, there was already this danger of syncretism. Baal was the male fertility god. Asherah was the goddess of fertility, and the rituals of Baal and Asherah coming together in kind of a sacred intercourse would maintain and ensure the fertility of the land as the seasons moved from winter to summer. There are two seasons in Israel: the rainy season and the growing and the harvest season, the dry season. These gods would have their shrines, right? Where you would go and you would pay a certain amount of money. You would get involved with the ritual in whatever way. And part of the ritual was sacred prostitution, where, Asherah was being worshipped. She had her, uh, I guess, priestesses, you might call them. And, men would go pay their tribute, so to speak, and lay with one of these representatives of Asherah and thus assure fertility. But the whole complex of having a center around which, religious worship took place is what Solomon adopts for Jerusalem. Remember, David did not build a temple. David built a palace, and he brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jebus, this hill that we now know of as Zion. He brought the Ark of the Covenant there, and it was up to Solomon to create the temple. And Solomon built the temple, and there he housed the Ark of the Covenant, which did not leave until it was removed under violence and threat of the Babylonians. And that would have been in 587 BCE. So any questions about Baal and Asherah? It's a fascinating sociological interaction that's going on at this time in Canaan. Well, you do know that already there is kind of a, a separation between the southern herding community and the northern agricultural community. And the tribes of Judah and Simeon were the herders, right? Remember, David was a shepherd. But then all of the other 10 tribes in the north were agricultural tribes. So already there's a kind of an uneasy tension between those two perspectives. Well, Brueggemann makes the point that the first thing that Solomon does is to try to bring this whole landscape together under a very controlled type of social arrangement. And Brueggemann calls it the project which results in the abandonment of the radicalness of the last 250 years. The worship of a free God, which manifests itself in an egalitarian community of justice and compassion. That radicalness is now going to be abandoned. The first thing Solomon does, I mean, this follows exactly what Samuel was telling to the people. He creates a harem, which allows him to control the self-perpetuation of uh, his aristocratic class, right? It's kind of some social engineering going on, right? This is where where you find your you find your paramour. Not only and that's probably not as important as the next one. And he creates a system of tax districts. And I found this map on the internet and found it to be really quite interesting because if you look at where these districts are, these are usually centered around, various cities as they were known this time, but they're not following any of the traditional landscape markers of the 12 tribes, right? Manassas and Issachar and Zebulon and all of those. Now there's a different grid that's laid over the landscape that is not tribal. And remember, the tribal grid was held together by this confederation of people who um, maintain their faith in God. Choose this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Now it is choose this day whom you will pay your taxes to. And so what Solomon does is he breaks up that confederation and places a new sense of identity on them. Now they are allied by their, their consumer, their taxable work, you might say. Uh, and when you have money coming in this way, oh, one thing I wanted to point out, isn't it interesting that the tribe of Judah down below, it's believed that they may have been exempt from all of this, right? It's the agriculture that is going to be taxed. And remember also what's happening in the world at this time. I mean, you've got trade. This area that we're talking about here is a land bridge between Asia and Africa, and people are moving, north and south all the time. And one of the ways you make money if you're a king, right, is you charge a toll, you charge a tax on people following the Mediterranean shoreline down to Egypt, For example. So Judah is really not, you can see that they really don't have any dog in that fight, right? Because the trade routes really are going through the northern kingdom. Judah really can't raise much in the way of taxes. Go ahead, Will.
Well, the other passageway for traders and attackers is in the upper right-hand corner of your map, about where
Yep.
the B is in Bashan, which is the
Yep.
Golan Heights today.
Yep.
And we can read about the Golan Heights even in the news today. But they would move across, and we got to look across at the Golan Heights on our trip to the Holy Land.
And yeah, where that B is the place where you start to make the northeastern move up towards the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and then you would fall that route down into Babylon, and actually the Silk Road extends through here as well. So uh, Solomon's got a really nice situation, right? As long as he can keep this area together. Now, Solomon's son, as you know, is going to mess this up completely because he's going to refuse you know, uh, to be fair with the people of the northern kingdom. And they break away. And look what happens when they break away. All of that territory in the tax district basically goes away. Hey, guess what? You need us. We're gonna leave. And then the two kingdoms break up into a very wealthy kingdom in the north, and then in the south, a kingdom that still has to maintain integrity through this tradition, this monarchical tradition that begins with Solomon. Uh, not a very, kids who are the sons of kings never end up being very smart. It was the dumbest thing that they possibly could have done. But anyway, in order for all of this tax money to be utilized properly, a bureaucracy had to be created around this, which included a standing army, right? Look at how we are starting to recapitulate, or we're starting to reflect uh, some of the social structure and political structure of the great city states going all the way back to Babylon and Egypt. You have a very few people with all the power and all the money at the top and access to God. And then you have everyone else, the 95% or so, who are manipulated by them and basically used as pawns in this game. Standing army, as well as this uh, fascination with wisdom. Solomon is known as, this wise king. Hey, I mean, it that's a tradition. It doesn't appear that Solomon was wise enough to be able to manage all of his wives and all of the religious traditions that he allowed to infiltrate his country. But the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and the wisdom literature is attributed to Solomon. Brueggemann makes the interesting point that this is a kind of objective, a kind of an intellectualism that comes to take hold of the king and the kingdom itself, a kind of rationalizing that doesn't appeal to the wisdom of God, does not appeal to the experience of God, but takes the first step towards a reasoned approach to organizing the kingdom. Um, in order to maintain all of this, Solomon has to conscript labor. We know that by the time of his death, the people of the northern kingdom were basically his slaves, and that's why they broke away from him. But then the most important thing that actually on page, whatever it is, 28 or so, 24, one thing that Brueggemann doesn't mention is that he has a centralized cult, right? A centralized cultus, so the priests, Levitical priests, and the priests of the Aaronite priesthood that continually worship God through sacrifices in the temple, to the point that God becomes almost held captive. I mean, God is held captive by the bureaucracy. No longer is God going to the people. And so it's an utterly new social vision. And what's going to come out of that is a new mythology as well that we know of as the Yahwist tradition. Um, but I just wanted to offer this quote on page 25. The tension between a criticized present and an energized future is overcome. Those are the things that supposedly marked the tribal communities falling under the guise of the Mosaic tradition. The alternative community tradition was marked by a criticized present and an energized future. That's nowhere to be found. There's only an uncriticized present and an unenergized future. Now the idea is to maintain the status quo. Hope is swallowed up in this kind of vapid consumerism, you might say. Now, I can imagine Denny has something to say about this, or somebody. Anybody want to jump in, make any comparisons, for example?
Oh, Dan, I think, I look at this in terms of the move from scarcity and survival to affluence and surplus
Absolutely.
and urbanization and the division of labor, specialization of labor. And inevitably, this has to be organized. Um, historically, we know that's the case. Um, like you said, in terms of managing, this uh, this wealth.
Mhm.
Um, and I would suggest that, the Southern Kingdom, Judah, is that right?
Judah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Probably was engaged in subsistence farming, which I would suggest probably characterizes farming in the United States largely until after World War II. I'm thinking
Mhm.
of my grandfather's farm in, Scrub Hill, Missouri. Um, they consumed what they produced, uh,
Right.
with a few sheep and, whatever.
Well, remember how the geography goes here in this dividing line right there about where the word exempt is also the rain line, you might call it. This was the region up here that was highly agricultural. And then you get into this Dead Sea area. This is the region where, you had the shepherds, right? The herders. Um, and you might think about the conflict between these two in terms of farmers and ranchers, really, that we still see today. Um, but when the split did come between the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom, Judah was going to be bereft of of all of its former wealth in many ways. And the Northern Kingdom itself was going to just model what they'd already seen happening in Judah. Uh, we're right now focused just on Jerusalem, but when Jeroboam breaks away in 922 and creates the nation of Israel, he does the same kind of syncretism and creating shrines and creating the same kind of structure that that is the abandonment of radicalness. Uh, and this is the area that Elijah and Elisha and Amos and Hosea prophesied against. So uh,
Seems to me that Walter Brueggemann is in many ways opposed to the notion of hierarchy, and bureaucracy. And I think it needs to be pointed out that all of this began about 10,000 years ago with the invention of irrigation and irrigation canals and gates, irrigated canal. The people who controlled the gates in an irrigated farming situation basically controlled the area.
yeah,
And if they could deny water, I'm thinking of, the Colorado River, Nebraska right now, uh, that's where, hierarchy begins. That's a long tradition that pretty much characterizes, most people in the world.
right.
That I think Brueggemann is punching at a bag that is the world he would like it to be, as opposed to the way in which survival and organization within an urban area, how are people going to feed themselves, once they have left subsistence agriculture?
Yeah.
Uh,
Now it's so interesting that you're saying this because then the question becomes, okay, if this is absolutely necessary, if we need to organize ourselves in this hierarchical way, then how can we do it in a way that's inspired by God? How can we maintain a sense of leadership that is directed by God instead of, simply leaders trying to control God? And this is where the idea of the Messiah, the anointed one, comes in. We will have a king like David who is chosen by God, right? Who will be upright and upstanding, who will have the concern. And of course, in David's life, this didn't happen. But the ideal, the seed is now going to start to be planted, right? And it's part of world mythology as well is the idea of the upright, righteous king. As goes the righteousness of the king, so will go the kingdom. And Jerusalem, with such a righteous king, will be the place where all the nations of the world will come, and they will worship God because of this, the just nature of the community that's created there. That is the monarchical messianic tradition that later prophets, like it's going to really begin with Micah and Isaiah, are going to now start to develop. And so now you have two traditions, right? You have the kind of the Mosaic prophetic tradition that criticizes and energizes out of the experience of the marginalized. Then you have this other experience that is dependent upon uh, the Spirit of God working through this righteous king. And of course, that the Christian tradition is going to bring both of those together. But that's what's going to be developed under this new hierarchical arrangement, right? It's why we still speak of the kingdom of God. Uh, both of those images are going to be incorporated into the understanding of who Jesus is as Messiah as well, both prophet and king. Um, well, I'll try to go over this because after we get through this section of the chapter, it's a good starting place. But this royal consciousness that's established is really marked by three dimensions. The first of those is affluence. Brueggemann talks about this section of First Kings chapter 4, verse 20 through 23. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, and 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides harts, gazelles, roebucks, and the fatted fowl. Well, pretty sure that not everybody's eating this way, right? Uh, this, though it's meant to be laudable, right? This is kind of the 10th century equivalent of the gold-plated Oval Office, and in my opinion, it's just excess, right? It's people getting fat, and there are going to be some who are the producers of that good who are not going to have the same we're not going to have the same advantages, right? And all of a sudden, in the kingdom, satiation, which comes with peace. Solomon's reign was peaceful. Peaceful. He didn't have people on the borders, Egypt or the Assyrians or challenging him. So in the midst of this, people become satiated by just the mundane nature of their existence. Pay your taxes, produce, but there's a large group of people who are living quite well. And inequality is created out of that affluence. And as Brueggemann says, the covenanting with the brothers and sisters of the Mosaic community comes to be replaced by consuming. Let me just read that for you. Covenanting that takes brothers and sisters seriously had been replaced by consuming, which regards brothers and sisters as products to be used. And in a consuming society, an alternative consciousness is surely difficult to sustain. Too many distractions. And there's something that takes hold when you have the have-nots watching the haves, right? Those who are marginalized watching those who are at the center of all, eating everything, that their hope becomes one of, I want to be able to consume like they do, right? And the focus becomes very, very, consumer oriented. So that's one of the dimensions of Solomon's kingdom. The other is an oppressive social policy, uh, forced labor, right? I mean, look, we're out of the frying pan into the fire. This is Egyptian deja vu all over again. Now you've got a certain moneyed class making more and more money for themselves by using human beings as tools, by by completely neglecting their rights that were guaranteed to them by the covenant, right? Uh, and then simply using them as objects. I'm reading a biography of, actually, it's another type of book. It's kind of a biography and kind of an exposition of Immanuel Kant right now. And it was Kant who came up with the idea of, these universal rights that every human being has the right to be treated as a, a, a subject, right, instead of an object, as an end in himself instead of as a means to an end by other people. I think it's exactly what, the covenant is trying to do. And when forced labor and affluence take over, justice and compassion are naturally going to disappear, because there's never enough. When Brueggemann wrote this in his, I think it was around page 27 or so, there's just never enough, right? And the thirst, the hunger for more and more and more comes to take over, and justice and compassion in the midst of that are just, those are things standing in the way of more and more and more. And I can't help but think of, Elon Musk requesting $1 trillion payout for whatever it is he does, There's just never enough. There's a certain kind of mania that takes over. Once you have more money than you ever could possibly use, no, I just want more. I just want more. I just want more. Empathy, says Musk, is standing in the way of that, right? That's the worst possible human virtue that, quote unquote, in his words, that could be imagined. So, anybody want to jump in on that? The third dimension of this royal consciousness is a static religion. An official mythology is now created. Remember, we were talking about the Yahwist tradition. This is basically the story of Genesis and the creation account that happens in Genesis. All of this is now becomes the official state mythology, the narrative through which the people are going to come to understand themselves. And when the religion becomes static, the freedom of God is going to be undermined. That freedom of God, which is a God of surprises, now comes to be very much a God of, predictability. If we go to the temple, and if we sacrifice as we should, then all will go well. And so eventually the prophets are going to, in the Mosaic tradition, are going to say, God despises your festivals because you're just going through the motions. We talked about that last Sunday when we were in church. Religion becomes centralized. The Ark of the Covenant no longer moves out among the people. There is now cultic mediation. The people can't go before God. They have to go through the priest who stands before God, and then, eventually only on a particular day of the year. So the king has come to monopolize God. And this is about as Marxist a critique as you can find, that religion becomes, a means of manipulating both capital and labor, right, by appealing to the moral sense of the people. And there is a kind of satiation that happens in understanding yourself as part of this big machine. And that's why Marx wanted to get rid of religion. And I happen to agree. I mean, this is the kind of thing where people are being manipulated by religion. This is the nationalism that we see happening today as well. So in conclusion, and this is the place where I was hoping we can get, and so we can have a nice transition next week when we get to about page 30. Brueggemann's quote is really helpful here. Obviously, he says, oppressive politics and affluent economics depend upon each other. Nevertheless, it's my contention, says Brueggemann, that fundamental to both is the religion of the captive God, in which all over againstness is dissipated. That mosaic over againstness of God, it's dissipated. It's just evaporated into the atmosphere. And the king and his ideology are completely at ease in the presence of God. The king is no longer being challenged prophetically. The king is utterly at ease in the presence of God. This God is no court of appeal for the marginal ones over against the king. For God is now completely beholden to the king. He's a tool of the king. It is precisely religion that legitimates and makes possible the economics of politics that emerged. That's almost right out of Karl Marx right there. You know? So we have a couple minutes. Any questions or final thoughts before we move into our week?
Is there any examples where surplus linked with or joined with hierarchy has ever produced anything, any form of society that Walter Brueggemann would be very pleased with? Are there any examples? We talk about New Harmony, but that's a blip.
Surplus linked with hierarchy. Well, this might be a strange example, but China seems to be doing pretty well these days. They've got surplus, they've got a hierarchy, they're moving it all over the world. Now, you know, I'm sure there are injustices that we're not aware of, but the Chinese seem to have kind of entered a new golden age. I mean, even those living in the cities at least. Um, but I know that's not what you're looking for. What do you think, Denny? Do you have a suggestion?
No, I'm just asking. I look from, 10,000 years ago with the development of agriculture
Hmm.
to the present time, and I don't see very many cases where, a hierarchy has, adopted a Brueggemann outlook, on the distribution of surplus.
Yeah.
A lot of chatter, was generated, with the Bolshevik Revolution
Oh,
that this
yeah.
this was going to happen. Um, but we know very well that, that devolved almost immediately into state capitalism.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the democratic socialism that we see, in some of the Nordic countries probably, from my point of view, comes as close to it as possible.
Yes,
But it's interesting what you're saying because the prophetic tradition that grows out of this, let's call it what you just did, hierarchy and surplus, probably recognizes the tendency towards excess in that and understands that the one thing that is going to keep that from happening is a leader who is inspired by God to ensure that justice and compassion are observed. Now it becomes the role of the Messiah, the King, the anointed one, right? And that's the prophetic tradition that we see developing among the priests, really. Isaiah, Ezekiel, that of a king who knows how to do things right, unlike the other kings who are crooked. We want a king who is truly inspired by God to be a king that works, for God's will. And these are the stories we hear so much about at Christmas time. This is God with us, right? Emmanuel. In fact, we'll be talking about this at our Sunday school class this Sunday. Um, this hope for a king who is the perfect representative of God that Christians come to see as Jesus, right? Uh, anyway, I think that's probably a good place to stop. Uh, and again, please forgive me because I'm teaching about the prophets in the Sunday school class, and I kind of getting confused on where I've said what. You know? And so because there's a lot of overlap in what we're doing. So, but when we return next time, we got to about page 30, and we'll pick up probably there at the top of page 31. The quote that I just read was on page 30. So please come with your questions and everything else. And I'll probably see you on Sunday, if not before. Mac, did you want to say something, or are you just saying
No,
about?
I'm just saying goodbye.
Oh, okay. I saw Ann on Sunday, Mac. I was a little disappointed you weren't there, but
Yeah,
yeah, but that's okay. We'll give you a pass.
thank you. I was at a Hall County Historical Society event, so it wasn't like
Right.
sticking around watching football.
Right, exactly. And she told me that event commemorated a certain, oh gosh, a memorial to Robert F. Kennedy, or an observance of Kennedy.
The
And you were
1968 campaign, yeah.
and you were 16 at that time, and you were. Tell me what your role was.
I was just a member of the Hall County Kennedy for President Committee.
Did you meet Kennedy when he?
No,
No.
I was,
Okay.
I thought that would uh, I was too busy making
Yeah.
sure that his trip went well,
Yeah. Oh, I bet. Yeah.
guiding people in and out of the depot. But it was a
Right.
very memorable event, and these people did a good job on it.
Yeah.
A lot of memories.
Well, good. I guess I will see you all next time, and it's always a joy. See you later.